as Kelsey mentioned, I'm Stephanie. I'm a PhD candidate at UNC-Chapel Hill, as well as an ORISE research fellow at the US EPA. And today I'm going to be presenting our work on daily and hourly exposure to PM2.5 and wildfire smoke and cognitive performance in a brain training game. And before I dive into the details, I want to make sure I acknowledge all of the brilliant people who helped me with this project, including my mentors and colleagues at the US EPA, my mentors and colleagues at the BC CDC, as well as my mentors at UNC-Chapel Hill. And I'd also like to quickly acknowledge the funding source that let me do this research project, which was the ORISE Research Participation Program. And I also need to add a little disclaimer that the views expressed in this presentation don't necessarily reflect the views of the policies of the US EPA, and mention of any trade names or commercial products doesn't constitute an endorsement or recommendation for use. So to give a kind of quick agenda of what I'm going to be going over, I'm first going to be going through some background and the objective of this research project. I'll then walk you through the methods we use to look into this research question, and then I'll walk through the results and end with kind of main takeaway points and next steps. So first, for the background and objective. So some of you may be familiar with this, but I wanted to make sure I gave some good background on the two air pollutants we're looking at in the study. So the first one we're considering is PM2.5, which is fine particulate matter, or particulate matter that's less than 2.5 microns in diameter. So as you can see on the figure to the right, it's very, very small particles, much smaller than a human hair. And these particles are emitted from cars, from power plants, from fires, and they can also be formed in the air during chemical reactions. And an important thing about PM2.5, and the reason we care about it a lot in public health, is that exposure is ubiquitous and continuous. So every time you open your door and walk outside, you're going to be exposed to PM2.5. And when you're exposed to PM2.5, it's going to be inhaled into the deepest part of your lungs, and it can even enter your bloodstream. And this exposure to PM2.5 has been shown to cause a lot of adverse health outcomes, including the risk, increasing the risk of all-cause mortality, and also increasing the risk of cardiovascular and respiratory morbidity and mortality. So it's known to cause a lot of problems, and exposure, everyone is exposed, so it really is important to understand the health effects of exposure to this air pollutant. The other pollution we're looking at is wildfire smoke, which is similar to PM2.5, but different in that it's not just a single pollutant, but it's actually a complex mixture of particulate matter and different toxic chemicals and gases. And a lot of the times when you talk about it from a public health perspective, the primary pollutant of concern within wildfire smoke is often PM2.5. But PM2.5 from wildfires often has a different composition from typical ambient PM2.5. And it's possible that this different composition could affect the toxicity, which may lead to different health effects when you're thinking about exposure to wildfire PM2.5 relative to exposure to typical ambient air pollution or ambient PM2.5 from cars and other general sources. Another important aspect of this is one of the reasons we care about looking into the health effects of wildfire smoke exposure is exposure is likely to increase with climate change as the frequency and intensity of wildfires increase, and also likely to increase with population growth and urbanization as more people, move and exist in areas that are going to be impacted by wildfire smoke. And similar to PM2.5, wildfire smoke has been shown to cause a large range of adverse health outcomes. And the most researched ones include an increased risk of respiratory and cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. And while respiratory and cardiovascular morbidity and mortality has been the focus of a lot of air pollution research historically, there's a growing body of evidence that air pollution exposure can also impact cognitive function. So a lot of the research into PM2.5 has found that exposure to PM2.5 can reduce academic performance in children, and it can also accelerate cognitive decline in the elderly. And this includes increasing the risk of Alzheimer's or dementia. In terms of wildfire smoke, there's been no research done specifically looking into wildfire smoke and cognitive performance or cognitive function, but research has looked at agricultural fires and has also looked at the use of fires indoors. And both of these have been shown to reduce cognitive performance on different neurocognitive tests. And in addition to the growing body of epidemiologic research into the associations between air pollution and cognitive function, there's also a growing body of evidence from animal and human studies, which can kind of illuminate the biological pathways by which air pollution can impact the brain. And by causing systematic inflammation, passing through the blood-brain barrier, or modulating the nervous system, air pollution can lead to brain inflammation and oxidative stress and cause these adverse cognitive performance outcomes that we're seeing in these studies. However, a lot of the epidemiologic evidence that's available today has focused on long-term exposure. So exposure over the course of a year or more, instead of focusing on shorter periods of exposure. So after looking at the literature, some of the knowledge gaps we identified is that there's limited evidence of the PM2.5 associations at the daily and hourly level. There's some evidence at the daily level and almost none at the hourly level. And we think this is a very important knowledge gap to fill, especially because concentrations of PM2.5 can change very rapidly during extreme air pollution events like wildfires. And it's important to understand how quickly exposure can lead to an adverse health outcome. Additionally, another knowledge gap we identified is that there's no evidence of the associations with wildfire smoke exposure. Again, people have looked at agricultural fires, but no one has specifically looked at wildfires. So we wanted to make sure we could also look at the impacts of wildfire smoke exposure. And finally, a lot of the research has focused on the associations in the youth and the elderly. So in children and people above the age of 65. And there's not much evidence of the associations in the working age population. And then when we think about the cognitive function impacts, it is important to consider that working age population because there's also economic losses associated with those cognitive function impacts. So given those knowledge gaps, the overall objective of this research project was to evaluate the associations between daily and subdaily exposure to PM2.5 and wildfire smoke and cognitive performance in adults in the contiguous United States. So now to kind of walk through the methods we use to execute this objective. At a broad level, again, we're looking at daily and subdaily PM2.5 and smoke exposure and cognitive performance in adults. And to link these two pieces of information, we use the longitudinal repeated measure study design with linear mixed effects models. And the images on the bottom of the slide here are kind of showing an example of the data sets we use to do this, but I'm going to quickly take some time to walk through each data set by itself. So for the cognitive performance data, we use information from the Lumosity brain training platform. And this is a relatively popular app. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may use it, but it's an app that's kind of targeted to measure and improve your cognitive function. And specifically for this analysis, we had data for over 10,000 users in the contiguous United States who are age 18 and older in a game that's designed to measure attention. And the specific game we're looking at is one called Lost in Migration. It's a game that's based on the flanker task, which is an established neuropsychological test that measures selective attention. And selective attention is your ability to focus on relevant information while ignoring distractions. So this screenshot to the right here with the blue background and the birds is an example of what the Lost in Migration game looks like. And the general point of the game is you have that central board and you have those birds on the side that are kind of surrounding it, and you want to ignore the birds on the side, focus on the central bird, and correctly identify what direction that central board is facing. And for this game, we had 20 time-stamped scores for each of the 10,000 users between 2017 and 2018. And in addition to these 20 time-stamped scores, we also had information on the user's age, their sex, their education level, the device they used, be it an iPad, an iPhone, an Android, or the web, and also their zip-through location. And the zip-through location is the first 3 digits of a zip code or a postal code. So for example, my zip code is 27516, so my zip-3 would be 275. So this map here kind of shows that spatial resolution we're working with when we consider zip-3s. It's a relatively large spatial resolution, but we do have data for a lot of zip-3s across the contiguous US. And you can see based on number of users, a lot of our users tend to be located in slightly more urban areas versus rural, but we do have some decent coverage of the United States in terms of where our Lumosity users are located. And then in terms of the PM2.5 data, to understand PM2.5 at the daily and hourly level between 2017 and 2018, we used data from 2 different monitoring station networks. So the first one we used was data from the US EPA federally referenced method or federally equivalent method monitoring network, which is kind of the US EPA established network of monitors. And you can kind of see the location of these monitors in this top map here. And we also use data from the low-cost network of purple air monitors, which has become a lot more popular recently, especially in wildfire impacted areas, to kind of understand air pollution at a more local level. And on the bottom here, you can see the location of those purple air monitoring stations. And to combine these two data sets, we use something called the Bayesian maximum entropy data fusion, which is a geostatistical method that's able to combine the data sets using information on the concentrations as well as the associated uncertainty of the data sets to estimate a more smooth surface of PM2.5 across our study area. And doing BMA, we were able to get estimates at the census tract level across the US. And this map here kind of shows an example of what that smooth data fusion estimate looks like. And then once we had that census tract level estimates, we needed to get it to the ZIP3 level to match the spatial resolution of the lumosity data. So in order to move the BME data fusion to the ZIP3 level, we use population weighting. And what this does is it gives proportionally greater weight to the PM2.5 experienced in more densely populated areas. So of census tracts within a ZIP3, we're going to give greater weight to the PM2.5 in the census tracts that have more people versus the census tracts that have less people. And again, this kind of shows the flow we're doing to get those ZIP3 level population weighted estimates. In terms of our wildfire smoke data, we're using information on smoke plumes from NOAA's hazard mapping system. And the hazard mapping system smoke product provides shape files of smoke plumes across the US. And it also classifies those plumes into 3 different densities: light, medium, or heavy. And for our wildfire smoke data, we decided to limit the analysis to the Western United States, which included California, Oregon, Nevada, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. It looks like I left Washington off that list, but Washington was included. And the reason we decided to limit it to the Western US is because this is the region of the US that experiences the largest and most direct wildfire smoke impacts. And for NOAA's hazard mapping system dataset, these smoke plume shapes are manually identified in satellite images, and we wanted to reduce the potential of any visual misclassification of those plumes. And we also didn't want to capture too much impact of prescribed burns, which is more common, for example, in the Southeast US. So we focused on the very wildfire impacted Western US for this wildfire smoke data. And then again, we needed to get this data to the ZIP3 level to match the spatial resolution of the lumosity data. So we took these smoke plumes, and for each ZIP3 on each day, we calculated the maximum daily smoke density observed in that ZIP3. So you can see here we go from the smooth plumes over to whatever the maximum density observed over that ZIP3 was on a given day. So for the statistical analyses, again, we did a longitudinal repeated measures design with linear mixed effects models. And this equation here kind of gives an overview of what we use, and don't be too overwhelmed by it because I'm going to quickly kind of walk through the key points of the pieces of this equation. So again, the outcome we're looking at is that score on loss in migration. So we have the score for a specific play of a specific user in their ZIP3 on a specific day or hour. So again, we have 20 plays for over 10,000 users, and we also have the ZIP3 they're in and the timestamp of their gameplay. And then moving into the other side of the model, the main exposures we're looking at, again, are PM2.5 and wildfire smoke. And for PM2.5, we're looking at both daily and hourly level exposure. So for daily exposure, we're looking at 7 lags of daily average PM2.5, which is PM2.5 the day of gameplay and then the 6 days prior to gameplay. So kind of looking in the days leading up to when they played, what was their exposure, as well as the day they played. And then at the hourly level, we're looking at the maximum hourly average PM2.5 in the 3, 6, and 12 hours prior to play. For wildfire smoke, while we were unable to look at hourly exposure, given we're limited by satellite overpass times for that hazard mapping system data set, we were able to look at daily and weekly level wildfire smoke density. So for the daily level, we're looking at the maximum smoke density at lag 0 and 1. So the smoke density the day of gameplay and the day prior to gameplay. And then at the weekly level, we're looking at the maximum smoke density in the 1 week prior to play. In addition to those, we're also controlling for learning over 20 plays. So an important nuance of the lumosity data set is people learn and improve their scores over time. So this red line here is kind of showing the average score of users over their 20 plays. And you can kind of see between play 1 through 6, they have a slightly steeper improvement in score, and then it kind of plateaus as they get to the end of their 20th play. But since we didn't want to capture any changes in score due to learning, we wanted to make sure we were controlling for that. So these variables here are kind of controlling for that learning curve we observe across users. And finally, we're also controlling for a whole host of other covariates to make sure there's no confounding present in our model. And this includes user and ZIP3 level characteristics, such as their age, their gender, their education, and at the ZIP3 level, the high school graduation rate, the percent poverty, and the rural-urban continuum code, which identifies how rural or urban a ZIP3 is. And then we're also looking, controlling for meteorologic and temporal variables, such as the time of day and day of week, as well as relative humidity and temperature, among other things. The full list of covariates you can see here. So using that model, the primary results we're going to be looking at in a second is for PM2.5. It's the change in attention score that's associated with a 10 microgram per meter cubed increase in daily or subdaily PM2.5. And we're reporting this result for both the contiguous US, so our entire study population, as well as for a subset of it within the Western US. And the reason we chose to look at both the contiguous and Western US for PM2.5 is we wanted to see if the association with PM2.5 was different in that wildfire impacted region of the United States. In addition to that, we also looked at these results overall and by potentially important subpopulations such as age, sex, and habitual behavior. And age and sex are variables we get from the Lumosity data set, and habitual behavior was something we added because we were interested in how individual behavior might impact the associations between exposure and cognitive function. And we defined habitual users to be those people who, you know, every day they get up, they have a cup of coffee, they open their app and play one game of Lumosity before they go to work. And that's the routine, they play it every day, right? So we have those habitual people who play at the same time of day, on the same days of the week all the time. And then we have the more sporadic users who kind of only play whenever they have time or when they're commuting or they have a downtime at work. So we kind of split people into habitual versus non-habitual, depending on their frequency and time of day that they played. For wildfire smoke, the main result we're reporting here is a change in attention score associated with light, medium, or heavy density smoke at the daily or weekly level relative to no smoke. And again, we're reporting this result for Western US users only. And similar to PM2.5, we're going to be reporting these results overall and by age, sex, and habitual behavior. So now I'm going to walk you through the results from this research project. So for PM2.5, the kind of big takeaway we're going to have in this plot, and I'll walk you through it in a second, is that there's significant negative associations for with subdaily and daily exposures. And again, this association we're looking at is the point decrease in attention score associated with that 10 microgram per meter cubed increase in PM2.5. And you can see in the yellow boxes here, I've highlighted the places we're seeing that significant negative association. So across all hourly exposures, the 3, 6, and 12-hour maximum, and also lag 0, which is the day of gameplay. And we're also seeing a significant association at the 7-day cumulative level, which is a person's exposure cumulatively over the 7 days prior to their gameplay. Notably, we're not seeing any significant associations between lag 1 and lag 6, which indicates that this association between PM2.5 and attention score is driven by very short exposures. So same day or shorter within that time window. Another important thing that we wanted to point out is that the associations are more pronounced in the Western United States. So the contiguous US are those pink boxes, the Western US are black circles, and you can see here that across the significant associations, there is a more pronounced association in those wildfire impacted Western US. And to kind of assign a number to it, for the contiguous US, we're seeing about a 25 to 26 point decrease in score per 10 microgram per meter cubed. While in the Western US, we're seeing almost double that with a 45 to 50 point decrease in score per 10 microgram per meter cubed increase. And to kind of put those point decreases in context, I'm going to bring this figure back, which kind of shows the range of scores. So scores range usually on average between 9,000 to 14,000 over the 20 plays. And so 25 or 50-point decrease might seem not that significant when you look at that scale. But something we wanted to look at is if you kind of consider the fact that people are exposed over all plays, what's that kind of cumulative exposure over their 20 plays going to lead to? So to quantify that, what we did is we used this association with same-day exposure to PM2.5, and we were able to calculate that exposure over 20 plays was associated with a 3.7% reduction in their final score, which is about 529-point reduction, and about 11 fewer correct answers on the game in the contiguous US. And then in the Western US, this was associated with an even higher reduction, so a 6.2% reduction in their final score at the 20th play. So about 880-point reduction in score and about 18 fewer correct answers on the game in the Western US. So when you kind of look at that point reduction over repeated exposures, we are seeing a notable decrease in users' performance on the game. Jumping into kind of those subgroup results, what we're seeing here is we have the results by age group in the Western and contiguous US. And before we dive into specific age groups, I want to point out that on the Western US, we're consistently seeing that more pronounced association than in the contiguous US. So we are seeing slightly higher decreases in score compared to the contiguous US. And then when we're considering which groups are most have the strongest associations, generally speaking, we're seeing that the youngest, those people aged 18 to 29, and the oldest age group, those older than 70, appeared to have the strongest associations. So for example, for people age 70, that's these purple diamonds here. You can see that in the contiguous US, they had about a 50-point decrease in score compared to, the overall decrease in score, which was only 25 points. So about double the overall association. We're seeing that more pronounced association in 70 plus. In terms of people age 18 to 29, you can see here in the Western US, we're getting associations closer to 100-point decrease compared to that 45-point decrease overall. So we are seeing a more pronounced association in those 18 to 29-year-olds. In terms of gender, we're not really observing any pronounced differences by gender. So you can see here between males and females, the associations across all exposures here are about the same between both genders. And again, similar to what we saw in the age group, even though they're about the same, the associations are more pronounced in the Western United States. And then in terms of habitual users, what we're seeing here is we're seeing a much more pronounced association in those habitual users. So again, habitual users are people who play regularly and frequently and have a routine to their gameplay. And non-habitual users are those more sporadic players. And we're seeing an association that's 2 to 3 times greater in habitual versus non-habitual users. So for example, if we look at the Western US here at lag 0, we're seeing almost a 150-point decrease for habitual users with this pink box for habitual users. And then we're seeing only about a 40-point decrease in non-habitual users. So about 3 times the magnitude of association in those habitual users than in those non-habitual users. And then kind of shifting gears to the wildfire smoke results. What we're observing here is we're seeing significant negative associations. Again, when I say association, I'm meaning the point decrease in score associated with light, medium, or heavy smoke density relative to no smoke. And we're seeing these significant negative associations for medium smoke density and heavy smoke density, and no significant associations for light smoke density. So looking here, we can look at light smoke density, and you can see in light smoke density, there's no significant association with any of our exposure durations. Looking at medium smoke density, we're seeing a significant negative association at lag 0, which is exposure the same day of play. And then for heavy smoke density on the right here, we're seeing significant associations at lag 1, so the day prior to play, and the 1 week max. So to kind of put some numbers to these associations again, for heavy smoke density at lag 1, we're seeing about 117-point decrease in score due to heavy density smoke relative to no smoke. And it's likely that this 1 week association here is driven by this association at lag 1. And again, to kind of put this in context with the scores, you can see here the scores range between 9,000 to 2,100, to 1,400 in terms of average. So when you have a 100-point decrease, maybe one game won't have too much of an impact. But again, if you're exposed over multiple plays, that frequent wildfire smoke exposure could add up in terms of cognitive performance. And then looking at age group associations, the first thing we kind of notice here is that the results by age group are a little bit inconsistent across the smoke densities and exposure durations. But if you stare at the figure long enough, you can kind of see that users age 18 to 29 and those age 40 to 49 tended to have the strongest associations. So for example, users age 40 to 49, which is this turquoise square here, if we're looking at heavy smoke density, had about a 250-point decrease in score due to heavy density smoke relative to no smoke. And that's compared to the only about 110-point decrease in the overall association. So we're kind of doubling that magnitude of association for people age 40 to 49. And then in terms of those 18 to 29-year-olds, this yellow triangle, we're seeing up to close to a 500-point decrease in score associated with heavy density smoke relative to no smoke, compared again to that about 100-point decrease overall. So definitely more pronounced, especially within heavy density smoke for that 18 to 29 and 40 to 49 age groups. And then in terms of gender, unlike the PM2.5 results, we're actually seeing a more pronounced association in males than females, specifically within the heavy density smoke category. So looking here, you can see that men had about a 250-point decrease in score with heavy density smoke relative to no smoke, compared to only about a 50-point decrease for females. So about 5 times the association for males than females, which does show that they tend to have a much stronger association with smoke, specifically heavy density smoke, compared to females. And then looking at the results by habitual users, what we're seeing here is that similar to the PM2.5 results, the habitual users tend to have stronger associations than those non-habitual users. So looking at an example within medium smoke density, we're seeing about a 300-point decrease for these pink squares, which are the habitual users, versus only about a 100-point decrease for these green diamonds, which are the non-habitual users. So we are seeing that difference in score between habitual and non-habitual users, indicating the potentially important role of individual behavior in these associations. And now I kind of have given you a lot of information, a lot of numbers, a lot of data, and I want to try and condense it for you to give you some kind of primary takeaways from this work. So the first primary takeaway is that there are significant associations between short-term exposure to PM2.5 and wildfire smoke and decreased attention in adults. So in both wildfire smoke and PM2.5, we did see significant associations between exposure and a decrease in score in the loss and migration game. Specifically with that, we saw the strongest associations with PM2.5 and wildfire smoke happened within a very short exposure window. So for PM2.5, we observed this association within just 3 hours of exposure, which is a very quick turnaround between exposure and observing an adverse outcome. And for wildfire smoke, while we weren't able to look at the hourly level, we're still seeing that response with the poor performance in lumosity within 1 to 2 days. So the associations we kind of viewed at the 7-day cumulative and the 1 week were driven by these very short exposure windows at the 1 day or less time frame. Another very important takeaway that I'm sure I've said many times at this point is that the PM2.5 associations were more pronounced in the wildfire impacted Western United States. And we think this is quite an important takeaway, and it could be due to a variety of factors, one of which is that different composition of PM2.5. So as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, wildfire PM2.5 does have a different composition than general ambient PM2.5, and that composition can affect toxicity. So it's possible that that difference in composition is leading to a more pronounced association in the Western US. With that, there's also other wildfire-related impacts that could impact that association, and this includes things like eye irritation from smoke. So if you're exposed to smoke, it can affect your eyes. Maybe that impacts your ability to use your phone or interact with the lumosity application. or wildfires increase anxiety. They're a very stressful time. People have increased stress and anxiety during wildfire events. So it's possible that that could impact your ability to focus or pay attention if you're in a stressful situation. So all of those factors might play a role in those more pronounced associations we're seeing in the wildfire impacted Western US. But we also think that the combination of these more pronounced associations in the Western US with those significant associations we're seeing with smoke could mean that wildfire impacted communities might be particularly vulnerable to the cognitive effects of air pollution exposure. And it's likely that this vulnerability might be further exacerbated under climate change and population growth. And finally, one of the other primary takeaways is that younger, older, male, and habitual users appeared to be most affected. So those 18 to 29 and over 70 had stronger associations in PM2.5 and wildfire smoke. With wildfire smoke, males tended to have stronger associations than females. And then for both PM2.5 and wildfire smoke, habitual users were more affected. And especially with the habitual users, it really highlights the importance of user behavior in these associations. And while we don't necessarily have a perfect understanding as to what role these user behaviors play, it clearly does play an important role in the association, especially since we're looking at an outcome like cognitive performance. And now I'm going to quickly walk through some strengths and limitations of this study. So in terms of strengths, it's one of the first studies to look at the cognitive effects of daily and hourly PM2.5 and smoke exposure in a large adult population. And I especially want to highlight looking at smoke exposure. Again, this is the first study to look at wildfire smoke exposure and cognitive function. So we were able to identify that significant association, which is quite notable. And then also I want to emphasize our ability to look at hourly associations, because a lot of previous epidemiologic studies looking at the associations between air pollution and health outcomes have focused on the daily level, and that's often due to limitations of the health data sets, because those are usually only available at the daily level. So one of the benefits of the Lumosity data set is we're able to look at subdaily associations and identify how quickly exposure can lead to a decrease in cognitive performance. And we think that identifying these hourly associations is important for potentially informing those time-sensitive public health decision-making processes, especially during extreme air pollution events like wildfires. Another important strength of our study was that we had repeated measures for over 10,000 diverse users. So again, 20 plays for over 10,000 users. This large-scale study let us overcome some of the limitations that are often associated with clinical or laboratory studies, which can be time and cost intensive. And by doing this, we were able to identify a significant association in that understudied working age population. Additionally, another strength was our ability to use BME data fusion to estimate PM2.5 exposure. A lot of prior epidemiologic studies use data from the closest monitoring station to inform exposure, but by using BME, we're able to combine two different data sets, and then using population weighting, we can get a more informed understanding of what a person might have been exposed to. And finally, a notable strength of our study is our results are largely consistent with existing research. So a lot of the previous studies, while they focused on longer term exposure, did identify significant associations between cognitive function and air pollution, and our results further confirm that. And additionally, identifying that younger and older age groups seem to be more vulnerable does align with the existing research that exposure can reduce academic performance in the youth and increase cognitive decline in the elderly. However, our study is certainly not without limitations. One of the more notable limitations is that lumosity is not a clinical measure of cognitive performance. So while studies have been done on lumosity, and it's been shown that use of lumosity can improve performance on other established neuropsychological tests, it's still unclear whether lumosity has generalizable impacts on everyday learning and cognitive tasks. So we think it's a useful indicator, but it's not a clinical measure. And additional research used on short-term exposure using more clinical measures could be useful. There's also the possibility of exposure misclassification in our data set. So we're looking at ZIP3s, which are relatively large spatial areas to study air pollution, especially as concentrations of PM2.5 can change really rapidly during wildfires over very short distances. And we also only have data on the ZIP3 of a user when they signed up for lumosity. So if, for example, I signed up in North Carolina and then moved to California, my exposure is still going to be assigned to me based on my North Carolina zip 3, which would lead to non-differential exposure misclassification and would cause us to potentially underestimate the true association between exposure and cognitive performance. Additionally, while we think the differences between the subgroups that we identified were interesting, they were not statistically significant. And we think that more research using a larger data set could be useful for more clearly identifying which subpopulations are more vulnerable to the cognitive impacts of air pollution exposure. And finally, the generalizability of our findings might be limited to populations like the Lumosity cohort. So people who sign up for brain training games might be a specific type of person. So it's possible that our results are only generalizable to people like that cohort of Lumosity people who opt into something like a brain training game. And next, I just want to highlight some future work we're thinking about that we think would be useful to kind of build on this research. So we think first it'd be really useful to explore cognitive domains other than attention, especially looking at short-term exposure. Again, we're one of the first studies to look at short-term exposure in cognitive performance. And there's a lot of other domains of cognitive function, such as memory, executive functioning, language. And it'd be really interesting to see if the associations we observed with attention also exist within other cognitive domains. And we also think that Lumosity might be a useful tool for this because it provides controlled and repeated games for a large population. It could be a useful tool in more epidemiologic research, looking into the associations between environmental exposures and cognitive performance across a number of domains. We also think it'd be really valuable to investigate the interaction between wildfire smoke and PM2.5. So a lot of prior studies have found PM2.5 health associations to be more pronounced on smoky days. And this could possibly be due to higher concentrations on those days, due to the PM2.5 composition, or due to co-exposure with other pollutants. But since we know there's obviously a very close link between wildfire smoke and PM2.5, and that PM2.5 is on the causal pathway between wildfire smoke and adverse health outcomes, we think it'd be useful to kind of further dig in to specifically the interaction between wildfire and smoke and PM2.5 as it relates to cognitive performance. We also think it would be valuable to examine the role of individual behavior in these associations. So as our habitual behavior results show, user behavior clearly has an impact on the association between exposure and cognitive performance, but it's unclear exactly why. So we think additional research would be useful to better understand the role of individual behavior in these associations. And finally, we also think it'd be really valuable to evaluate these associations in other populations and regions and using different measures of cognitive performance. And this is especially to validate our findings and further elucidate these relationships. I think it'd be really helpful, again, to see if this association exists in other wildfire impacted regions like Australia and other populations with different demographic and other characteristics, as well as using other measures of cognitive performance just to confirm what we're seeing and kind of further understand the association between short-term exposure to pollutants like PM2.5 and wildfire smoke and cognitive performance. And finally, I wanted to highlight some additional information. If you're interested in this work, we actually just recently had an article published in Environmental Health Perspectives, and I've listed the title of that here. It's a very similar title to the title of my talk today, and I think the link should also be dropped in the chat. And in addition to the article, we've built out an interactive dashboard so you can go explore the results and kind of interact with the data sets we use to do this analysis using that QR code. And I think that, again, the link should also be dropped in the chat. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And if you don't have time to ask a question today, you can feel free to email me at my email here, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you might have about the project. Thank you.